Actually, I can't see you. So good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Georgeson, and I'm the Executive Manager of the Literacy and Young People Service here at the State Library of Queensland. I'm going to be your MC for today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all. And there's quite a few people still arriving, but we do need to start because otherwise we'll get behind schedule. In a moment, I'm going to invite Auntie Carol to do the traditional welcome. But before that, I'd like to acknowledge the effort and commitment that you have all made in coming here today. People have come from all over Queensland. People from Townsville and Moreton Bay, Deception Bay, Logan. I can't mention everybody, but we even have people from as far away as Alice Springs. So it's a big effort and commitment and a contribution to this forum, and we really acknowledge that and appreciate that. And to also acknowledge your expertise as leaders in the literacy field. I think it's really important to I guess, honour the fact that you're all leaders in your field by the sheer fact that you're here today. I would also like to pass on Jeanette Wright, our new State Librarian and CEO's apologies for not being here today. She really wanted to be here today. Also Jane Cowell, the Director of Public and Indigenous Library Services. They've travelled up today to the Northern Peninsula to open a new IKC at Yipirinya tomorrow, so they can't be here today. For those of you who are not familiar with what an IKC is, we operate in partnership with local government, and the councils are responsible for the infrastructure, staffing and day-to-day operations of their IKC, while the State Library of Queensland provides set-up materials, staff training and fun literacy and recreational programs. The centres provide traditional library service, including information and communication technologies, as well as a means and a place to capture and preserve local history and traditions. The State Library of Queensland provides support as an advocate and financial partner to the state's extensive public library network. There are over 340 public libraries and Indigenous knowledge centres throughout Queensland, and as part of this support, the State Library is expanding Horizons grants for family literacy for 2010-11, provided $250,000 to support family literacy programs in 14 Queensland local government areas. Today's forum is a fantastic opportunity to showcase the family literacy project initiatives that were funded by the grants. As you know, libraries are transformative places, and literacy is the bedrock of their ethos and rationale, with a focus on engagement, discovery, reading, belonging, and I guess working on that very difficult task of engaging people with the resources that you have. Libraries offer a specialised workforce and programs and collections to aid literacy support in communities. So I guess on a macro level, we're all involved in that work of improving people's access to literacy in Queensland. And on a micro level, I guess you know about that work where you engage with your community. It might be a small child who's just learning how to read. It's very important. So without further ado, because I know Auntie Carol is in a bit of a rush this morning, I'd like to invite Auntie Carol up to do the traditional welcome.
Jinjara Balawala means greetings to many. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our past elders and respect to our present elders, as they hold the knowledge, the wisdom and the stories to share. And Yilang Nahabala tribe, my skin it belongs to two tribes, the Boonabah, Toten the porcupine, down Fingal, and Yuwayung, my mother, the Mullinjali clan, Toten the eagle, down the desert or Logan area, and Yubayung, my father. I speak the Yugambeh language from the 8 groups of the Yugambeh region of southeast Queensland. It is always our custom and culture when we walk and talk on the land to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Jaguar people, this side of the Brisbane River, and the Turrbal across the river who lived and took care of this part of Mother Earth for many, many, many thousands of years. Aboriginal culture, it is the oldest living culture in the world, and our people, we give praise to our Creator, who placed our ancestors in this beautiful land, which was named Australia, gave them their culture, and that culture, it has been taught and handed down from generation to generation for over 60,000 years in our spiritual ceremonies, our art, music, language, and Dreamtime stories. Welcome all the travellers to beautiful Brisbane. It's a bit overcast today, but it is a beautiful country. And Ningara Yanabara, I have to go. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Auntie Carol. And I'm sure Auntie Carol won't mind me mentioning that she is a practitioner herself, in the sense that she told me that she used to work in an Indigenous kids early childhood centre, and told me that it's really important to get Indigenous kids early so that they can understand the value of reading and learning. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land we gather upon today, the Turrbal people and the Jugara people, and pay respects to their ancestors. Thank you, Auntie Carol, again. So, general housekeeping. The toilets are located down the stairs, just as you came in the front entryway there. Morning tea and lunch will be served just outside the auditorium. And should we need to evacuate the building today, please follow the instructions given by State Library staff. Alternatively, you can just bolt for the door. I'm not supposed to say that, but I think there's plenty of State Library staff up here if you need to know anything more about the building and what to do. Today we will be live streaming our keynote speaker and the library presentations. Because of this, we'll be using roving microphones during question time. So please wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask your question. And as this group, the forum today, is quite a small, intimate group, please do contribute and participate as you feel you need to or you want to. And we're going to have a prize at the end of the day for the person who actually provides an inspiring anecdote of an outcome that they have seen in their work. I'd also like to acknowledge that there are people here who've travelled and made the effort to come here who are not from library backgrounds, and I think that's really great. Our keynote speaker has made a huge effort to come today, and I'll introduce her in a minute, but she's from Central Queensland, from Alice Springs, but we've also got people here, I understand, from the Smith family, and I want to acknowledge that the Smith family do amazing work in this area, and we have a representative, I think Catherine Ullman, here today. We've also got someone from the Mansfield, Susie Bosnay, from the Mansfield State High School. Cole Sutcliffe, also from the Smith family. And we have Jennifer Mobbs from Playgroup Queensland. If I've missed somebody, please forgive me and just make yourself known throughout the day. That'll be fine. There'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions in between the presentations. Okay, so I'd like to start the process by introducing our keynote speaker, Margaret James, who's very well known for honey ant readers. Margaret James, it's awesome to have her here today with us as our keynote speaker. And as I mentioned, she's travelled all the way down from Alice Springs, and I think she's also travelled with a colleague, Rosemary Swayo, who teaches in Alice Springs. So thank you also, Rosemary, for making that effort to travel down today. Margaret James, she's famous. Margaret's been involved in Indigenous education for many years at the Yipirinya school, but also in other areas. I know she's lectured at a tertiary level, and she's an author and an advocate and a leader in this important field. I know she's also interested in singing, choral singing, and is a talented performer and practitioner. I think what's outstanding about Margaret's work as a practitioner and also a leader in the academic field is that she's really brought together that synergy between rigorous academic research and the actual practice of our work. And because as we know, that's a difficult thing to do. Margaret's passion for and expertise in early literacy language acquisition, English as an additional language, singing and Aboriginal English inspired the development of Honey Ant Readers, a unique reading program for Indigenous EL learners, written in collaboration with Yipirinya school elders and community in the language of the playground. So as you will find, Margaret has done an amazing job to base her work on research, but also to work with community and to give them agency over their own process. So I think it's extraordinary. So please join me in welcoming Margaret James.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I'm worthy of any of those esteemed words, but thank you anyway. I'd like to first of all pay my respects to the traditional elders and keepers of the land, the Yungawa and Turrbal people. It's great to be here, and when I've finished, if you'd like to meet my witchetty grub at the back, we dug him up on Friday, and he's still in his little root of the tree, and he's alive and well. But he needs to stay here because he's a gift from the Luritja people. And the honey ants as well. There are probably about 20 honey ants at the back. So feel free to try one if you like as well. This morning, I'd like to expand your horizons beyond the city, beyond the crowded buildings, the noise, mainstream schools with libraries full of books, featuring white children and standard English of the medium of instruction, and take you into the desert of Central Australia, to the open space, the silence, the Aboriginal way of living, where the traditional classroom is the red sand, and the bush and the teachers are family members. Subject matter is passed down through many generations, and the knowledge is communally held. In the same way, teaching them to read, we're expanding the horizons of Aboriginal children, expanding their world to understand and become part of mainstream Australia. I'd like to take you out into the bush for a moment, if we could have the first video. Thank you. These are the honey ants that I've got at the back of the room.
La yogurt, Luna Natil, yogurt, more yogurt.
The second was
Aaron?
which is always a difficult sound, actually.
This is mulga tree. This is where we find onions, where the onions is, and the onions nest. And once we found the onion nest, we start digging around the nest and then dig in the ground to get some onions.
Down the end, get honey and sitting at digging in the red sand. Run, a big mulga tree. Yum, yum, yum. Lots of honey in the cup.
Jamal! Nak side ko ni dig na jaga. Nan side is na that.
That's which thing, Taka.
Down the end, get honey and sitting at digging in the red sand.
Kilsiya, try to find ma ko ira ngayo. Nanyo na ular daga. Eda walpat, all right?
Honey.
Para para press.
Oh, you can't use the balloon.
Hi. Para ma ko ira nan side ara na ewan na nang ngake nang press pa non. Walpat ma pa pa. Para nindi da. It's busted one, is it? Good one.
In there.
Yeah, I made this.
Ewan na kaya press pa non ngama walpat ma pa nang dila jep.
And yeah, a couple of fish. Yeah,
We going back to get some containers.
thank you. Do you want to, Amber, you might. No.
Yeah, made them.
Kumalay. You go play ngayo. This is a stick. What we use to dig, get the honey ants out from the ground there.
We're digging for honey. So we can eat them.
Wow, what is it?
That's yummy. That's honey in there. It's very yummy. A woman dig for honey too. Nina.
How do I move these?
And little kids. They dig like the day.
Yeah.
And thing when you sticks to dig a honey ant. Here's a black one.
Yeah, actually,
There's a black honey ant. He's biting. Take black. I saw you. He's going there. Jamal grabbed him.
Down the end, get honey and sitting and digging in the red sand. Run, a big mulga tree. Yum, yum, yum. Lots of honey in my cup.
and suck it.
Woohoo! Naga? Every weekend, I take my kids and my grandchildren at bush to look for bush food and show them how to dig honey ants or witchery grubs, or go and look for bush banana so they could carry on teaching their kids.
Thank you for watching. Bye. Na 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 ding ding it there was it. And when you find an ant with big, grab it with your hand, grab it with your hand, grab it with your hand.
Have any of you ever tasted a honey ant? Well, now that you know how to eat them, holding the head and sucking the honey out, give it a go if you'd like to. I had to commit a terrible atrocity on these poor little honey ants, because if you leave the heads on when you put them all together, then they bite each other and take the honey out of each other's sacks. So one of the first things you have to do when you put them all together is to take their heads off, poor little things. So I stand guilty as accused. They're very tasty. Language is the vehicle for the expression of a culture and of its people. The busyness and speed, the financial and possession focus of the city is reflected in its language with words like latte and Google, stock market. Standard English is full of complicated mathematical, scientific, and technical terminology. Things are quantified in time down to the nearest fraction, compared and analysed. Children grow up familiar with numeracy, aware of birthdays and counting. They grow up surrounded by printed matter and people who can read it to them. Because of the very different life in the desert, the language out there serves a very different purpose. It's uncluttered by terminology. It doesn't have the abstract language of maths and science. Traditionally, it didn't have numbers. It went 1, 2, 3, and then many or big mob. But it's full of spiritual meaning, expressions of a relationship with each other, and about the land and the law. And the norm is to speak 4 or 5 languages. Where mainstream society regards rapid change as progress, the traditional Aboriginal culture regards keeping things the same as progress, maintaining the environment, the food supply, family relationships, marriage, and other laws. Aboriginal languages, not just in the desert, are oral. The vocabulary is precise, and within it the law and ancient stories are passed down around a fire with facial gestures and facial expression and hand gestures, as well as silence being as much of the language as the words are. In selecting the text for the books, I take into account the difficulty that speakers of Central Australian languages are likely to have in speaking Standard English. I'll divert here a moment just to very briefly discuss some of the differences between Central Aboriginal languages and Standard English, and also Aboriginal English from Central Australia, which in the books I call the language of the playground. The most important point I'd like to make here is that Aboriginal English is a language in its own right. It has its own set of rules, and it deserves the respect that Standard English receives. It's different to Standard English in all aspects of a language. In its pronunciation, it has its own grammar rules. It's very different in terms of meaning, so same words can mean different things in Standard English to what they mean in Aboriginal English. The vocabulary is very specific to the culture and how it is used, and it is an oral language, as are all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. And as we know, because you're all librarians, written English is very different to spoken English, so it changes a language a lot when we write it down. In the Honey Ant Readers, I decided to use aspects of Aboriginal English because rather than writing in different languages, that is a language that all Australian teachers can access and use, and it makes it easier for the speakers, as well as in acknowledging their language, it offers them respect, builds their self-esteem. I refer to it, as I said before, as the language of the playground, and that is because in Central Australia, where I work, we have children from various different language backgrounds coming together, and the lingua franca that they speak is Aboriginal English, as it is in all parts of Australia when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people get together. I'd like to just quote Ian Malcolm, who's a highly respected linguist in WA in Perth, a retired professor from Curtin, but to me he's the guru of Aboriginal English. He was one of the first people who stood up and started speaking about it, researching it, and it's now very strong in Western Australian schools. Aboriginal English has certain agreed forms that are recognisable right across the continent, which are expressions of the identity of Aboriginal speakers. So let's have a look at it in its written form, and afterwards I'm going to play you a video of somebody speaking a bit of Aboriginal English. So here's some phrases, and I'd like you to have a guess to what they mean. If they come up on the screen. Okay. Any offers? Sorry? Got to drive it? What is it? Any guesses? So if you say it aloud, you might get it. Heard it in the front. Motor car. So just very briefly, what's different to Standard English? Can you Can you tell me a few things that are different? D for tea. So in Standard English, we have tada, paba, kaga, and the only difference between ta and da is that we don't voice ta, but we voice da. In Central Australian Aboriginal languages, and also in Aboriginal English, they don't differentiate for voice. So the ta and the da will be a sound somewhere in between. So that's what happens, yes, in Aboriginal English. Anything else? So we've got that in motor car, and we've got that in the da and in the ga. The ga would be ka, so kaga. Got a dry bit. What's happened there? Dry. So we've got the ba, which we call a plosive, replacing the v, drive, because in Central Australian languages, and also again in Aboriginal English, what's happened is I've studied Central Australian languages, but as I've travelled working with my books and then tapping into elders and people all over the country, I'm realising that there's so much common ground with all the languages. I've just come back from the Tiwi Islands, and so much of Tiwi, which is so far from the centre and on the coast and everything, so much of the Tiwi languages is the same. And so that's sort of how Aboriginal English came to be. So with they don't have the v, so they don't have f, s, sh, sh, which we call fricatives. So they often replace what we call a plosive, the v with the b. So bidio, you've probably heard people saying bidio. Anything else? Okay, yeah, so that's right. So the language is condensed. Okay. And also, what about the question? How would we have asked that question, the first one? Can anybody just throw me any idea of a question? You have to shout. Do you have a motor? Yeah, okay. Thank you. So, do you have a is all missing. And tomorrow I'm going to speak in more detail about Aboriginal English, but it doesn't have what we call auxiliary verbs, so the do you, have you, are you, and they don't have the articles, so the and the. Thank you. Let's try another one. Any guesses? You can call out, yeah? The back? Very good. Okay, thank you. Do you speak Aboriginal English? No, okay. What do you notice here? So my mum has been to the store. I waited for her. She's gone to the store. I'm waiting for her. So the tenses are different, yes. So instead of saying went or jumped or had, all past tenses are signaled by the word been. So if there's been, it's referring backwards. So my mum ibn goes store. So e would be she. So in Aboriginal English, there's no differentiation between he and she. And there also isn't the h, which is a fricative, and there isn't the sh, which is also a fricative sound. So e. So and because it's a language that is on various, it goes from a heavy variety to a light variety. So you'll hear the H's sometimes and not sometimes, the past sometimes and not. So this is just looking at the basic grammar that you might encounter. So Eben goes store, so been to the shopping, waited. So it, because there's no differentiation between masculine and feminine. This is a little bit tricky, but this is really what a child said to me. So any guesses? Sorry? He bit me? No. Anything else? So if you remember that, what I said about video, how they don't have the f and the v and they substitute pa and ba, does that give you any? He? Could be. So if we replace the ba with a f, yeah, he's fighting with me. He's fighting with me. He'd bite me. We've been telling him not to give him nothing. We told them not to give him anything. Nothing. So could been running long way. So what do you notice about that in terms of the... Yeah. So they don't have comparatives, so they don't say big, bigger, biggest. It's all done in terms of either repeating a word or extending it. So you've been run long, long way that time. This is a little bit tricky too. Big mob, Deben eat that kid kawana. So what do you think? What do you think that means? Yeah, good. Okay, good. Now the baby goanna bit isn't what this meant. Remember, they don't say s. So if we put s after kid, what would we be saying? Thank you. In the front, kids goanna. So it's actually, there's no possessive marker. So there's no the kids goanna, nana's umbrella. It's all just, it doesn't have this sound on the end. All that story belong us mob. Okay, all those stories are ours, belong to us. Thank you. De Anihans, that way they live. You probably heard them saying that on the film, didn't you? Yeah. So lib is live, and they don't. The H is interchangeable. So they might say, it's raining, get me a umbrella. But they'll say ani for honey, and so the H, I think that probably is similar to Cockney English, actually. Aboriginal English is closer to Irish English than it is to Australian English. So that's a little bit of an interesting fact. So de Anihants, so I'm often called Nana Anihant. That's where they live. Okay, this was Trudy and Kamala, who told me a lot of the stories. She's a Western Islander elder, but this is her talking about some nanny goats. He went every day with them nanny goat, sat down and waited before that dingo get it. That's what he'd be doing for a long, long time. Any comments on that? Dem nanny goat. So we've got the da replacing what? Yep. Sat down, wait it. Again, we don't have the gender, he or she or him. And we've got the long, long time. But we've got the past tense went. Yeah, so it's likely to be plural, isn't it, in the context? Because Aboriginal English is a spoken language, it's just totally contextualized, you know. So, as I said before, a lot of the expression, and when I show you Yazzie in a moment speaking Aboriginal English, I'd like you to look at her facial expression. She was quite unaware that she was doing it, but a lot of what is said is through eyebrow movements and the nose and the hands and so on. So, sometimes they might say, yeah, big mob. Or you know, they obviously use, in Aboriginal English, they have all the numbers now, so they might say 8 dog. Yeah, okay. I think I'm going to, we could put the video on again, thank you. So if you listen to Yazzie, she's a librarian actually, an Aboriginal librarian in Alice Springs.
The whole school community, and especially the council members, are really proud of where these books have come from. They take pride in it because it's their stories. They've had a lot to do with the making of the books, and they can see the achievements the kids have already started picking up on, and kids that haven't been able to read before. It makes those old people proud to know that their bush stories are now being introduced into standard and context English for our kids to actually learn. So therefore it's instilling that our stories are being kept stronger because it's now put into books. Yeah, I think the concept behind them is really great. It's encouraging our kids to read, just having the familiar storylines they're used to, stories they've heard from their grandparents on a number of occasions to be turned into a book. That's bringing their lifestyle, I guess, into a standard lifestyle other people don't live. The concept and context of the books the kids can understand because it's how they're spoken to on a daily basis, and familiarity is the best thing. A lot of the kids are learning and picking up standard English by using the Aboriginal English because it's familiar to them and they can understand the concept that the book's been made from. Here are some different examples of different strengths of Aboriginal English that you come across in the text of the Honey Ant readers. Hey, did you go and see the mob's family earlier part? They need a little bit of help. They're struggling there to get them kids to school. You might need to go and help them, hey, talk. Don't be ashamed for your kids. Go and talk so your kids can get an education. Hey, where you been going? I haven't seen you a long time. Did you see them kids the other day? They was asking for you. They will miss you, you know. One of them was even crying for you. You should go and see them up after. They'll be really happy for you. Hey, them are going for Yaramba after. You should ask to go. You can go and dig that honey ant again with them. Did you like that Yaramba? It's a real sweet one, eh? I don't know, I might come with you, Mum. See if that little one wants to go. She's been a little bit sick one too lately. I'd go doctors first, might be. But you should ring up after and see if they go and tell them, Min, you're going to go with them with these kids.
Yazzie went away to boarding school for her secondary, so she's got very good standard Australian English as well, and she can flick between standard English, Aboriginal English, and a couple of languages without any trouble at all. As she mentioned there, the Honey Ant readers strengthen standard English. That's the irony of if you respect and acknowledge first language and work in first language in terms of learning to read, it actually strengthens your second language. So that's perhaps not necessarily what people would expect, but it is what happens. I'll go back to the city again, to the next horizon I invite you to join me on, and that is storytelling, the differences in the way that we tell stories in standard English and out in the desert. So mainstream stories mostly have one author and are shared through books. Creative ideas are judged and spelling is corrected. They're found in libraries and often read in solitude. Reading isn't generally a group activity. In Central Australian culture, stories are communally held and not individually made up. They come from way back, a massive geographical horizon and vast expanse of time. They're bigger than one person and they're shared with children from birth. So I'm just going to move these down a minute. Through narrative, they teach the law, the ways of living, the ways of finding food, and the ways of keeping safe. As an aside, I'd just like to comment here on the impact that the new NAPLAN, which was brought in last year, has on these people, where they took narrative out and put in persuasive text. Persuasive text is just not part of Aboriginal dialogue. So, in my opinion, it's putting an extra challenge on already seriously challenged learners. All their stories have a moral. The characters are generic, meaning they don't have names, and I've mirrored that in the Honey Ant readers. So the characters are Nana, Big Sister, and so on. They're regarded, along with their Dreamtime stories, as being true. When the elders share their stories with me for the Honey Ant readers, I take them at face value, knowing full well that there are many layers beyond which I can see, but which the learners will appreciate and understand. I sometimes notice when I am somewhere that Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people will come and pick up the books and be absolutely fascinated, and I know that they're seeing something in them that even I don't see. There's an elder who came to me recently in Melbourne. I was at a conference and there were lots and lots of people, and she just came down and she said it was like a magnet. I saw the books and I just came straight to you, and she was an elder from Melbourne. So as I say, they do feel a great sense of ownership because all the characters are Aboriginal and all the stories are Aboriginal. In the Honey Ant readers, we use stories that the elders want their children to read. The first 11 books are based on daily activities such as digging for honey ants, hunting for a goanna, a dog jumping on the school bus and causing chaos, a snake found up in a tree, which of course has a different meaning to the children in the centre. When they see a snake up a tree, that's food. When I see a snake up a tree, it's danger. So the later books then include a lot of the stories told to me by elders, and and I've tried to remain as authentic as I can. That's when the vocabulary reaches over 65 words, because the early books gradually evolve in terms of how many words I use. They're an early reading series. So book 1 has 7 words, book 2 the same, 7, and then book 3 has another 6, and we gradually build up. So you need a certain number of words before you can bring in a different story, really. Having started with Honey Ants and Nana, they sort of reoccur for the first, pretty well, the first 10 books. I regard myself just as a facilitator, not really the author of the books in the true sense of the word. I brought my knowledge of teaching literacy, of linguistics and so on, and combined it with the traditional elders' knowledge of storytelling and what they want. Something that's interesting is that the familiarity of the books actually evokes emotional and physical responses in the readers. So I'll have little children going, "Oh, Margaret, you've been making me hungry," when they see the honey ants, on the page, because their mouths start watering for the honey ants, or when they see a goanna running across the page. They also see themselves as characters in the books. And of course, we know that if you become emotionally involved in a book, that your learning increases and improves. You want to read it, it makes more sense to you, and so on. I had an experience recently where I was at St. John's College up in Darwin, and I was doing an activity with all secondary students who are low-level readers, and a student came into the room, and she was from Central Australia, and she got so excited, so she read this book. She was reading book 12, Drowned Him, with the teachers, and then she just put the book down and started telling them the story, because it is a traditional story that she knows. And it was a wonderful thing to see, because she got so excited, and the teachers ended up asking her questions. And I had another experience on the Tiwi Islands last week with a little 8-year-old girl, and I started doing the card games with her, because I always pre-teach the words before I give the students the books with those words in them. And we'd done all the words, and then we started reading, and she read book 1, and she put it down, and she read book 2, and she put it down, and she wouldn't stop reading, and she took book 3, and then she said, "This is really funny. Those books over there, I can't read them. I can't read, but I can read these." And so that was lovely, and it's because she could associate with the characters and associate with what was going on, although she was a coastal child, which is interesting. We just scanned this morning, and it's a very bad imprint, but I don't know if you can see it. It was in 2009, and it's Kevin Rudd. And can you read what's on the book? It says, hang on a minute. I think I've got the original here. Indigenous Disadvantage Report. And he's saying, lucky they can't read. So I'd like to stress from the start that a lot of what happens in Australia, what mainstream Australia does with Aboriginal people, is to impose their ideas on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It started with the point of a gun a long time ago. It's very little is true collaboration. I think that many programs have very good intentions, but very often what happens is they go up to a group of elders and they say, "Now this is our idea, this is what we think you should do. What do you think?" Rather than going in and saying, "How would you like to teach your students?" Or, really doing it from the bottom up. And in terms of this program, I've tried as hard as I can not to be the sort of middle-aged, middle-class white woman coming in and trying to dictate. I've tried as best as I can to go from the bottom up and to hear the stories that the elders want me to use for their children, and for me not to censor those. Sorry. Those are two of the people that I work with in Central Australia. We structured the elders and community stories into a reading series about Aboriginal people in their language so that they feel ownership. Most of the material available in schools is very Anglo-centric and not suitable for Aboriginal learners. The elders didn't want their stories just written down as they told them to me. They've done that before. They wanted them put down in a form that would enable their children to learn how to read. So I had to take the stories, break them down into little bits and pieces, break them down, as I say, into 7 words, and I'll tell you later how I chose those 7 words. But what I've done is every step of the way the elders proof everything, and I talk to them. So I have Jennifer in Kamala, who I refer to as my cultural mentor. She looks at every illustration and the birds, and then we have a council of elders that represent 7 language groups, and they oversee everything. So I put it down, and for example, I've just brought out some therapy cards that look a bit sort of like this, that I was asked to put out by a professor of psychiatry in Canberra, and I've just put them out for Indigenous people. So I took them to those elders, and I had 120 cards, and they actually removed 2 of them and said they'd like to replace them with something else. So, you know, whatever they want to do is what I do, but I bring my ideas in of how to teach reading, which is what they wanted me to do. Today I'm going to be focusing on the on the development of the books, and tomorrow I'll go into more detail about what the books actually are and the different aspects of the books. As I said before, they began with a very simple goal, and that was to help Aboriginal children in Central Australia to learn to read. That was what we wanted to do. At the same time, I brought in a program to teach them to speak standard Australian English, but they needed to learn to read the way they spoke. You just can't learn to read if you don't read already in a language that you don't speak. You have to get the oral language first. And then once you can read, you can read. So if any of you started to learn Icelandic or French or German or anything that had the same writing system, the same orthography as English, you wouldn't have to relearn how to read, how to decode. So we need to get children reading, and then of course they can read in standard English as they can in any other language. But by not offering them reading in the first place in their own language, we never get them reading. And that's what's been happening. I think I've got another... No, okay, that's the elders. So many approaches in the past have failed, so we felt that clearly we needed to try a new one, and it needed to come up by, from the elders themselves. Something that's always fascinated me working with Aboriginal people in Central Australia is that they are such incredible linguists. The children I work with, as I said before, all speak 4 or 5 or more languages, then Aboriginal English, then Standard English they move into. They also have such incredible acute vision that they'll see a tiny lizard running from, to the back of the room. So if they've got this fantastic visual acuity and they've got this fantastic linguistic ability, why aren't they reading? And this is shown throughout Australia on all our national literacy tests. So my approach, I worked at Bachelor Institute with Indigenous teachers from around the country, and it's fun because I sometimes bump into them when I'm travelling around now, which is lovely. And I taught singing at Yipirinya school in the beginning. And so I became very aware of this Aboriginal English thing and decided that because it was sort of referred to as bad English and talked down to, wasn't given respect, and all its speakers were learning to read in a language they didn't speak without ESL support, I decided that would be where I would start. I'd like to give you a quick overview of where the children come from, it's very sad. I work with the children from the town camps of Australia, of Alice Springs, and from the outstations. They come from a very different landscape, as we've said before, and you've seen it with looking for the honey ants. But also the behaviour and expectations in the classroom are completely foreign to them. Hunting and languages are their strengths, being outside. They speak many different languages, as I said before, and the lingua franca that they speak together is Aboriginal English. In the town camps, they may suffer extreme disadvantage, neglect, trauma, abuse from an early age, and often. A large number also have conductive hearing loss. And although sound field systems, hearing hats, speech therapists are brought in, that doesn't get to the bottom of the problem, which is basic hygiene at home and infection. We know that with education, hygiene and so on improves as well. So reading seems to be the key to get them through this. Children commonly go home to find extra visitors in their houses. They might be drinking and partying going on all night. I know that some of the children that I teach feel safer on the streets at night, and they're not very safe in Alice Springs. They feel safer on the streets at night than they do at home. They then go home when all the revelry is stopped and fall asleep, and that's just the time they're meant to be coming into school. So when they do come into school, if they do come in, they're pretty traumatized. And they're full of trauma and they're full of pain, and of those, we all go through pain at different times in our lives through different circumstances, and we know that when we're in pain, emotionally. We can only think of the immediate. We can only think of getting ourselves through that day. We can only think of ourselves, actually. We can't really extend our love out to other people when we're suffering. And I think we have to remember that when we look at the behavior problems in the schools. I kept the book simple, with the text in the language that the children speak and the content relevant and culturally appropriate, in order to take away another big hurdle in their learning. The aims of the books are, of course, reading, but a very important part of the books is to build up self-esteem and confidence in these learners. They come to school expecting to fail. They come to school in the past having been told that this English that they speak is a rubbish language, don't speak that in the classroom. So every aspect of the books I try and build the confidence, so I use the things that they're used to, but also book 1 has these 7 words which are chosen for the sounds and the meaning that the children will, so sounds that children will be able to make and meaning that they'll understand. And the same 7 words are used in the next book, and then I gradually build up. But I use the same 7 words in the first 2 books, so that when they've succeeded at book 1, I know they'll succeed at book 2. And that gives them a huge boost. We also teach all the words before they get book 1. So their first experience of picking up the book is one of success. They don't have to go nana to work it out. They already know nana, so they flick through the book and they experience success. And it's very exciting to watch that with learners of all ages, because they're not expecting it. I'll tell you a bit about where it all began, and these are some of the elders that I have worked with. I started by observing in classes, meeting with elders, meeting with community to find out what they felt that they needed. And I came to the conclusion that one of the things they needed was an individual program that could assist with this school attendance issue. So if a child goes out bush for sorry business or doesn't come to school because they're tired or whatever, they don't get left behind, because every child is in their own spot. I also decided there was a need to develop a program that could be used by non-teachers, so by tutors and assistant teachers, so it didn't require teaching to be administered. The elders worked with me, and any changes they suggested, I did. I was very fortunate to have a relationship with the elders, and I developed that first of all through Bachelor Institute, and secondly going to Yipirinya to teach singing. And at one stage I had several choirs, and I was teaching each class, and I brought the elders in and members of the community, so they would sing with us, but also they would translate the songs. They would help me to choose songs that they wanted their children to do, because there's been a very strong Lutheran influence. When it comes to the end of the year, they like to do Christmas carols. So we translated those into Pitjantjatjara, Luritja, Central Aranda, Western Aranda, Warlpiri. Those were the main languages. We would translate them. The elders would work with me, make sure that I had the pronunciation right when I was teaching the children. And I even got, I've got a photo in a moment of, I even got Jennifer and Kamala, who's in the top left corner. I even got her conducting in the end. It was quite funny. One concert I did, we had all the little preschoolers, and they got up to sing, and I got up to conduct them. And 7 Aboriginal women from Central Australia, language speakers who'd been working with me, got up as well. So we had 8 of us conducting this little group. I'm not sure that anybody could see anything other than some fine posteriors, really, but it was quite fun. The elders were very excited about the project. What I did was I recorded them telling me stories that they wanted me to listen to. I had more offers of stories than I could record. I also recorded the children speaking, so that I made sure that this language of the playground was authentic and what is being used right now in Alice Springs. I obviously had done research before, and so I had that behind me as well. So the language in the books is authentic, and the stories are all authentic. And then, of course, for the bush tucker stories and so on, I actually go out bush with them, so that I have first-hand experience as well, which is lovely. The Council of Elders, as I said before, still proof every book before it goes through. So once the data was collected, I set about developing book 1, which is, no guesses for what this book might be called. So book 1 is Nana Dig. I chose 7 words: Nana, dig, ant in, red, sand, and run. Now, sand is which is a sound that isn't in Central Australian languages. But if I were to tell you that the Aboriginal English spoken in the centre only shares 7 of our standard English consonants. We have 24 consonant sounds in standard English. Only 7 of those are used in Central Australian languages. So for me to write books with 7 consonants was quite a task. So I brought in the S sound with words that children would be familiar with. So we've got sand and snake in the first few books, otherwise I managed to avoid it. I also just stuck to the short vowels, so when the children see an A, they know it's a, and so on. Just those 5 short vowels. Standard English has 20 vowel sounds. So we just used the 5 short vowels for the first 6 books, and it took me 13 books to bring in all the vowel sounds. So all the sounds are very, deliberately brought in. There's a picture of us doing a bit of singing. So this is book 1. So the words were chosen because they were familiar. They were easy to pronounce for the learners. There's a phonics program going through the book, so the short vowels. Aboriginal grammar. Well, in book 1, there isn't really grammar. In fact, an interesting point about these books is that there's several non-Indigenous Standard English speakers in Australia learning to read from these books, and particularly students with special needs. So you can see that's just got the page and the picture. But where we start combining words, I bring in ant in red sand. So that is in keeping with Aboriginal English, not the ant in the red sand. So they don't have the articles. And then at the back of the book, back of every book, I have a song. So that we can learn the Standard English. What I do is I get the students to learn to read in the language that they speak, and at the same time I teach them to sing in Standard English, so they're getting the oral English that they need before they can start reading in Standard English. So we're doing the 2 at the same time. My passions are literacy and singing, but my background is linguistics and TESOL, so that meant that I could see the value in phonics, language acquisition, and using first language as an entry point into reading. I've said that. A bit about the underlying pedagogy and why I did what I did. All learners come to school with the same amount of linguistic. I'll let you read this first. So if I can just do an analogy, and you've got Mary, who comes from a background where she lives out in the bush, and she hasn't had literacy, she's had no exposure to print literacy, nobody's read her stories, she doesn't speak Standard English. And we've got Johnny, who comes from a Standard English background with parents who've been reading to him since he was very young, and they both come into school. Now, they both have the same amount of cognitive and linguistic knowledge, but John is building on the knowledge that he already has, which is Standard English. And so he carries on up. Now, Mary's come in and she doesn't have any of that knowledge, so she can't build on that. So what happens is that she goes backwards as Standard English is being used in the classroom, which is what she doesn't speak. And not only is she sliding backwards while Johnny goes up, she's being left behind, but she's also learning that she's actually a failure, that she's not actually as smart as Johnny is, which of course isn't true at all. And so that was sort of why I did what I did and what I based my pedagogy on. If you take a child or anybody and try and make them learn something that's way above where they're at, it's instead of going up, learning happens in little steps. Instead of going up in little steps, it's like walking into a wall, and it becomes impossible. So we needed to break it down into smaller steps. And we did this by looking at the language that the students speak and the sounds and the meanings and match that in the text. So how can we move the learners from this Aboriginal English into the Standard English that we know they're going to need for schooling in Australia and for high school, and to enjoy all your books in your beautiful libraries around the country? So we can teach them oral Standard English through songs and rhymes, because we know from research that this is a very successful way of doing that. And we can also gradually scaffold them from Aboriginal English into Standard English. The way that I scaffolded them was that we know quite a lot about how we learn to speak a language and how we learn to speak a second language. There are certain stages that we believe that speakers go through when they learn English as a second language. And I'll go through that in a lot more detail tomorrow. But what I did was I moved the books from Aboriginal English into Standard English according to the stages that we believe we learn English as a second language. So for instance, the ing form of the verb, the ing, comes in fairly early. The verb to be, I am running, or the apple is red, comes in quite late. So they only come into my later books. The verb to be, for example, comes in quite late. That Nana's goanna, or the kids goanna, that apostrophe S, that possessive, only comes in later. So I gradually evolved the books from one to the other. So they sort of go through an intra-language stage, actually. At the same time, I've translated from book 11 into standard English. So they've got the Aboriginal English version and the standard English version, so that if their reading is behind their acquisition of English, they can actually move their reading across, and it follows the same building on the words and so on. And we've also translated the first 3 books into 6 Indigenous languages, and many, many more are going to happen. I've received some funding, and I've also had quite a few requests from different communities to do that. So songs and rhymes are a great way to teach a language, to teach all aspects of a language. By singing, you memorize the words and so on in a way that you don't do by speaking. You get the rhythm and the stress and the patterns of the language. We also know that phonological awareness, so awareness of the sounds, correlates highly with reading. And we also know that if we divide 2 groups of children and we do a lot of singing and rhyming with one group and not with the other, that the group that have had rhyming and singing are going to acquire reading more rapidly. They plateau off after about 5 years, but they master that skill more rapidly because they become aware of the sounds of the language. In the context I work in, it's particularly useful to do group work because, as I've said, their culture is to work in groups, but also they don't get shame, they don't get shy because they're working in a group. So that's another advantage of using singing. So what I'd like to do is, I'd like you to try and read this for me, please, and I'll take you on a little journey of learning to sing. Could you try and read that to me? Okay, that's literature. Okay, now I'd like you to just humor me for a moment, and I'd like you to sing with me. So we could put the little bit of accompaniment on, and you'll all know the tune, I'm sure. You have a listen. Kami kami chawani, chawani parna. Manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala. So we'll sing that together in a moment, but we'll learn it line by line first, if that's all right. So let's try. Sorry? No, you're not meant to be reading it. Kami kami chawani, kami kami chawani, chawani parna, chawani parna. Kami, 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 chawani parna. Once more, we'll add the other words in. Kami, kami, chawani, chawani parna, chawani parna. Manchini chala, manchini chala. Manchini chala, manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala. Okay, let's have the music again and we'll do the... Kami kami chawani, chawani parna. Manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala. Kami kami chawani, chawani parna. Manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala. That means grab it with your hands so they go, mantanku manchini chala, mantanku manchini chala. They love doing that. But so was that any easier to read after you'd sung it? Okay, so I guess I rest my case on that. It's a really good way to learn a language. I'll just quickly go in summary. I've spoken about the difficulties Aboriginal English speakers are likely to encounter in reading standard English texts, how we use Indigenous stories based on real life, how we use the elders' stories based on communally held stories. We don't have names. We use generic names like big sister, brother, uncle, and so on. The books have been produced in collaboration with Indigenous people. They're not being imposed from above. They start in the language of the playground and progress to standard English using the stages of language acquisition. And I use songs and rhymes to teach pronunciation and grammar of standard English. So when I was doing the words earlier, I mentioned that we have a phonics base, that the vocabulary also compounds. The font starts at 60, it's a very big font, and it goes smaller and smaller to here. That's the size of the font, that's book 14. The illustrations go from simple to complex. Everything is trying to make the entry into reading as simple as we can. I don't use punctuation either for the first 5 books, so that students don't get confused between a comma or an exclamation mark and a letter, because these are children who come from a background where there isn't print literacy, so everything is new. The books also address numeracy as well as literacy. A lot of numeric activities have come out of them. And I watch the children working, and older, actually, secondary students and adults working with the books a lot. And then I keep adapting them. It's sort of a work in progress all the time. And I noticed the first thing that the students did was to lay these books out and make a pattern with the borders and start counting the ants and so on, and counting people. There are 2 people on the seat next to each other, and then there's 1, and that makes 3, and so on. So I started putting those activities into the books. The one last point I'd like to make is that these books, although they were written for Central Australia, they're actually being used all over the country. In every state of Australia now, they're being used. And I don't know for sure why. I ask people who are using the books why they're enjoying them, and I think I'm often told because they're easy and because it makes me want to read. The people look like me, so when they read the book, I was up in Derby recently, and the children were going, "Oh, that's me in the blue t-shirt, and that's my auntie in the green t-shirt." So they're seeing themselves in the books. And also I've been asked to put a set together, so this is my first for Mandarin speakers, so this one's gone off to China, so I'm doing a similar thing for speakers of Mandarin. So the pedagogy underlying the books is actually suitable for everywhere, and I'll be working with Tiwi and with the Ngangatadara lands to develop books for them fairly soon, and possibly northern New South Wales as well. I wanted to just mention something, and I'm going to then put on a last video. A lovely experience that I had recently up in Derby. I was at the school, and when I walked into the classroom, there was just a small group. I thought I was working with a small group because I normally do. There were about 5 students, and everybody else had gone to breakfast, and they hadn't gone because it was peanut butter, and they didn't like peanut butter. So I called them my peanut butter and not peanut butter group in the end. But so I started working with them, and the group got bigger, and there were non-Indigenous students who were clearly way ahead in their reading and literacy. And every question I asked, they were answering, and they were out there. And this group of Indigenous children, which is about 50% of the class, were very quiet, and clearly they were the ones that had lower levels of literacy. And I started the books, and then I read this one, which is the story of the rainbow serpent in Ellery Waterhole, and there are rainbow serpent stories all over the country. And suddenly, it was incredible. The Aboriginal students just started taking part, and the others started going quieter. And the one girl said, "But why did she sing to the snake?" And the Aboriginal kids were looking at it as if, "Well, what do you mean, why did she sing to the snake?" Of course she sings to the snake. She sings to the snake and makes it go blind. And so the Aboriginal children started explaining to the non-Indigenous kids what was happening in the book, and they got up and they grabbed other books, and it was really fantastic. So they clearly saw themselves then as the keepers of that knowledge, and they knew something that the children who were normally way ahead of them in literacy didn't know. So I think those are the sorts of reasons why the books seem to appeal to Aboriginal people everywhere. I'm going to put a video on now. And then, which was Impaja came and filmed, and they said they'd like to just do this for me as a gift to show to you. And then after that, I'm very happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much. Having trouble with the video? It's the one that's on the DVD. So, slides that I didn't get to while we're waiting. Okay. I think you click on the ant. No? keep showing you these slides in the meantime. I think that's probably...
Nana, 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 dig, dig in the sand. And when you find an ant real big, grab it with your hand. Grab it with your hand. Grab it with your hand.
Our kids are getting a lot more familiar with reading. I've noticed they're picking up a lot more books. They're encouraging the younger kids to read, especially when they're using the honey ant readers, I guess because it is familiar. It's everyday culture in those books, and they know they've been written specifically for them and the rest of the Indigenous population to learn to read from. I'm from Alice Springs. My family stretched from Kings Canyon over to Altunga. The honey ant readers are really good for our kids. They help them to learn in our context.
Say hello to Nana. Hi. Nana is so happy with you, friends, with your children. She's very, very happy with you because you're all sitting quietly and listening. Dig, Nana. Dig. Dig. Nana was digging, digging deeper and deeper. And she gets there.
With the artwork as well as the wording makes it more familiar.
Only the kami, the Nana, digs the honey ants, not the old men. The books are good for the kids to learn, so they can learn more and more in their language. The pictures are really good, showing how to do this and that. They really like it.
It's good for the non-readers because it actually opens it up for them to love reading, really. It's a stepping stone for them to be able to, even if they don't know the words and they've got the pictures there, they know what it is, and then they get to learn to know what the word looks like, and just simple lettering.
Hamish, can you give me bus?
Bus.
I'm going to go faster and faster now. Rowena, can you give me in?
It's amazing. You hold up a picture and they'll yell out, Nana! And you're like, okay.
Dig, dig, yep, dig. Put a counter on it if you'd like to dig. In.
Oh, we're going to have to wait for the next word.
Next word is... Wait.
And you're right. That was one,
Bingo!
I've seen kids that couldn't pronounce your standard English words that are now using them in everyday vocabulary, and they're quite confident. And I hand that down to the honey ant readers and what they're actually doing to help the kids.
The old man walking to the creek. The snake drowned him.
What happened next?
He made the snake blind.
Did he? And then what did that mean for the water?
And everybody swam
So how come they can swim in the water now?
where the snake's blind.
Ah, great.
Just familiar and sight words too, I think, which encourages them.
And when they know that word, it makes them want to learn more.
What's he doing here?
Eating a snake.
Do you like eating green tea, Leland? Do you? And what's happening here?
They cooking it.
So it's encouraging the kids to love reading, to love learning.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I just want to bring it back to invite you to ask questions, or even give your responses in terms of how you connected to what Margaret then presented. So we have a roaming mic, and I'll just ask if you do want to make a comment or to ask Margaret questions, to stand up and introduce yourself before you speak. So just wait for the mic. We have one here.
Hello, I'm Trina Morris from Sunshine Coast Libraries. That was really great, thank you.
Thank you.
You said that the Council of Aboriginal Elders would sometimes ask you to take things out of your books. Can you give us some examples of things or reasons why?
The only ones that have come out of the books are, for example, I think it might have been that book you saw the boy reading, where I had the humpy on the first page, and I didn't do the type of humpy that they would have lived in that particular area. So they redid it, resketched it for me. With the therapy cards, so the therapy cards are to be used for expression of really happy things to be used. We will be using them in the school. I've just actually had them printed to tell stories and so on. But I also wanted to put confronting images in there, which is what the psychologists and counsellors will be using them for. So I had one of a funeral, and the Central Islander and Luritja teachers said that they would rather have a funeral, the funeral I had was what they would use up in Arnhem Land, and they wanted one that looked more like the kind of funeral they would have down in Central Australia. So it's been more a thing of, it doesn't look like, exactly what they do, yes. And another interesting thing was, and that it's in book 11, which I've got at the back, or I've got it here, no, sorry, later book, where they have a book 15, they have a parenti, and if the parenti's just eaten a goanna or a smaller animal, when they disembowel it from the back. But if it's eaten a snake, they disembowel it from the front. So there are all those bits of knowledge that I had to know. So it would be that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margaret. That was fascinating. I'm Jane Carpenter from Playgroup Queensland. I'm actually deputising for Jennifer Mobbs if anyone's looking for her. What I was interested in is how much the Education Department has embraced this as a way of working, because I saw a documentary a couple of years ago about their new DG, who I think was from Queensland actually, and he was very strong on the fact that he didn't want children to be taught in language that they should be using standard English. So I'm just curious to know how widespread this work is.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Private schools, of course, are slipping it in. Western Australia is very aware of the need to use Aboriginal English, and Queensland as well. The Northern Territory, sadly, which is how I ended up being up there, because when they stopped bilingual education, I got very upset about that, wrote a paper, and I was then taken on by Batchelor Institute to lecture there. But sadly, they brought in a policy recently of nothing other than standard English for the first 4 hours of school. They are starting to modify that a bit, I think, because of the protest. I do understand on one level, if you've got a community where there are very few language speakers and you've got no trained teachers, the children have a risk then of never becoming literate, if they haven't got good literacy teaching. So then they are better off learning literacy, probably in a second language. But the Northern Territory Department of Education isn't very in favour of Aboriginal English yet. We're working on them. What's happened is there 6 schools in Alice Springs, the Indigenous education workers had a meeting with me and looked at the books and so on. They then each went to their principals and said, we want these books. So for the Northern Territory, and a lot of the private schools and Christian schools and Catholic schools are using them up there. So and some of the state schools are. But what it needs is, from the bottom-up approach, and that's why the Indigenous education workers came and met with me, and they said, no, we're going to get the change from the bottom up. We want our kids learning to read the way they speak. And also this thing of Aboriginal English, where a lot of people would say, I don't speak Aboriginal English, because it was always told that this is bad English, this is rubbish language. People didn't recognise that it's the way that you pass your cultural information, it's the way you express who you are, what you're thinking, what you do. And that's why it's this vehicle of communication across Australia between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Even people who speak completely standard English, it's their way of communicating things that you can't communicate in standard English. So, yeah, so mixed reception at this stage with different departments of education. The CEO of the Department of Education, the NT, is very supportive. And so we've kind of got it where it's going to be squashed in the middle soon, coming from the top and the bottom. So.
Thank you. Up the back. Louise. Oh no, sorry.
Hi, I'm
Hello.
Sarah Johnston. I work for Sunshine Coast Libraries. I was very interested in the artwork that you've got in your books.
Yes.
Where did that come from, and why did you decide on that style?
You mean the illustrations here,
Yes.
or the? What happened? The illustrations are a long story. I don't have an Indigenous illustrator at the moment, or haven't had for the books. In the beginning, I met with the elders and said that I would, like to have an illustrator, and they came up with different names, and all sorts of things just kept happening where people couldn't do it or they went away. And eventually I said, well, I spoke to the lady who was then the cultural principal at Yipirinya School, and I said, could I use some of the children, let the teachers nominate who they would like me to use, and have the children illustrating, because I was teaching them singing, so I knew them all. And the cultural mentor didn't want me using children then. Anyway, so it got very difficult and took a long time. It took 9 months, actually. And eventually I sat down and I said, right, guys, I'm going to be 85 before we launch book 1. So what are we going to do about this? And they said, okay, find an illustrator. And, my illustrator has to move at pace. I mean, this little kite book, what happened was ACER said, could they take my honey ant readers to China? And I said, yes. And rather stupidly, would you like me to try one for Mandarin speakers? At which point I heard that my mother was critically ill. So I boarded a plane to go back to Cape Town and did my research at the airport on the way, took it with me. My mother passed away, very sadly, but anyway, she had a lovely life, so that's all right. And then when I came back, ACR said, oh, we're flying on Saturday, and this was Tuesday. So I put this whole book together in 2 days. And so you can imagine the illustrator, the pace she had to work at, and the poor graphic designer who's at the University of Queensland. So I just went, right, girls, off we go. So I did need an illustrator who would move at pace. I mean, we've just, these therapy cards were 120 cards, for example. So that's what happened. But I used Jennifer and Kamala primarily as my sort of editor and cultural mentor of illustrations. She's a very good artist herself, so she'll sketch me things sometimes as well for the illustrator to copy. I'd rather have had an Aboriginal illustrator. Sorry.
Hi, Margaret. I'm Louise Bauer from Sunshine Coast Libraries. My question is, thanks for the presentation first, it was fantastic and I learnt quite a lot, so that's wonderful. But my question is around the ripple effect of literacy within the families that the children are living within. There's a lot of literacy issues in Indigenous communities. How do you find the honey ant readers contribute to supporting the literacy environment or the literacy needs of the parents and aunties and uncles that live with those kids?
Yeah. Some of the first books that were bought by the Western MacDonald Shire, and they put them into their children's services across the western arm of Alice Springs. And we had this discussion and I said, I suspect what's going to happen is the people working in those centres don't necessarily have very high levels of reading themselves, but because they know the content, they can actually work with the books, and that's exactly what's happened. A lot of those people, those adults, are actually learning to read in reading these books to the children. My dream is that I'll get enough funding for the children to be able to take all these books home, because we know that in the environment that I work in, the books won't come back once they go home. But that's fine. I was walking over the river the other day. Of course, the river doesn't have any water in it. A little voice came from underneath, "Hey, you that honey ant nana?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I've been reading that book 10 to my nana." So I knew that book 10 had somehow snuck its way home to a town camp house. I thought, yes, great. So I think, yes, what is happening is that they are being used, and it is starting. And also the Jeannie Macklin's office is actually funding me from when I go back now on Monday to work with the town camps parents from all the schools, and to try and engage them in literacy through developing resources with them that they can all feel ownership of. And it is having a ripple effect, yes. Mm.
Did that answer your question, Louise? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Gail Robinson. I'm a storyteller and I work as a community development consultant.
Hi.
I'm just curious as to whether there's been any, I mean, you're obviously going to Darwin as well, whether you've had any thoughts about creating them in an urban environment?
Yes, is the short answer. Definitely. It's all time, because it's just me. And so as soon as I can. And also, I mentioned I was the Tiwi Islands, and they are very keen to do them there and also in their language. So definitely an urban environment and a coastal environment.
And I think that's a really interesting point that you've made, because the AEDI data indicates that there are some really difficult challenges in urban communities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners. Yeah.
I'd like to just add that, I was asked the question earlier about Department of Education. I think the truth is I was only able to do this because I don't work for the Department of Education, so nobody could stop me, kind of thing. And so having done it and it being out there and it working is now building that sort of thing. Whereas if you were in the department, they would have said, no, we're not going to have Aboriginal English. This is, broken English, or, So I think I was fortunate, actually. Any other questions?
Just want to say thank you very much for the presentation, Margaret. We've been doing at the libraries I liked your comments on oral language and learning through Brian, because at the libraries we've been doing that for a number of years, and I think we're just realising the importance of that, especially with multicultural communities. My question is, you've worked about 7 years or more in Central Australia, how long did it take you to build up that rapport and that relationship with the community and the elders?
That's always difficult, and I mentioned earlier that I've been very, very lucky, because first of all I was at Bachelor Institute, so I met a lot of, I had a lot of students, and I was teaching the teachers, but I also used to go in and do singing and other sort of lecturing shots with the people of low literacy levels, and they were elders and people from all over the place, WA and all over the place, who are still in touch with me. I can still tap into them. And then when I did the singing at Yipirinya school, I got to know the council members and so on, and so that was my way in. It still takes a lot of time to build that mutual trust. When I was recording stories, it would sort of classically be an hour. We'd sit down, have a cup of tea and talk, and very often they'd say, okay, turn that thing off now, and then they'd talk away and tell me all sorts of things that weren't to be recorded, which was fantastic. So, yes, I think it was through working with people. And also, I think, being very careful not to censor the stories. There's one book here, this one, Big Man and Grab's Sister, and that's, the two sisters go, very simply, they go up hunting for bush tucker, and the one sister goes off on her own, and a man who's been watching her for a while goes and grabs her and takes her off to the cave, and she's in the cave, and then the family come along. Grandpa says, I think I know which cave she might be in, and they find her and they bring her back. And I've had somebody say to me, but that's just stereotyping women as just sitting in a cave doing nothing. This is obviously a Western person. And I said, yeah, that's fine. Two things are happening. First of all, I'm not going to change a story that's come down for hundreds of years. I've been entrusted with the story just to turn it into a readable form, but I'm not going to change the essence because I don't see all the layers. I mean, for me, simplistically, it's if you go out bush hunting, don't leave your sister and wander off on your own. It's as simple as that, but it's not really as simple as that. The other thing is that the book, what's happening with teenage learners is that this book is actually opening the discussion, and it's saying, how do you think Sister felt? What could she have done? When she was rescued and she was feeling, terrible about what had happened, who could she talk to? Do you know that in Alice Springs there are actually counsellors that you can go and talk to if you feel like Sister does? So it's actually serving that purpose as well. The main thing is, to keep the trust.
Any other questions? I might ask Rosemary if you would like to make a comment what it's like for you teaching in the local school there.
Rosemary's the preschool teacher at Yipirinya school that you saw on the video. She's come down with me.
Would you like to make a comment what that's like for you?
Thank you. Yeah, just to add on to Margaret's presentation, which is really awesome, Margaret. What I've experienced in my teaching preschool in Alice Springs and teaching the Indigenous children is that these books are also quite good for the parents of the children that I teach. Come in with the children, and when they see the books, they sit down and they read to the children. They just look at the pictures and they're happy. They appreciate the books because they feel it's part of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions for Margaret? Well, thank you very much, Margaret, for your presentation. And I think we've all enjoyed and appreciated not only the way that you go about your work, but the inspiration and the thought and mindfulness that you put into your approach. And I think what struck me was just how important that rapport is, and that respect and safety around working with community. I was really blown away by your comments around how you see yourself as a facilitator, not an author, and that ownership of the stories isn't with an individual or a publishing company, it's with the community. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Also, Margaret...
Thank you.
So Margaret will be here today and tomorrow running that workshop as she spoke about. So you can connect with Margaret on many levels, as you've just found, around her work and in the literacy field. And also, I'm sure Margaret will introduce you to her friends, the Witchetty Grub and the Honey Ants, who have also travelled down from Alice Springs. And yes, I think it's really amazing also to see the presentation there at the back, so you can find out more information if you need to. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, Margaret?
What I'll do tomorrow is I'll explain the pedagogy, but also it depends who's there and what you want to know, really. But then I'll do a hands-on, we'll do lots of hands-on activities, and I'll probably take you through the experience of being a second language learner. So we'll have the materials that I have in another language so that you can see what it's like for those learners. So, yes.
Good,
thank you.
So thank you. And what we'll do now is have a break for morning tea, and then after morning tea we will start the presentation on the family literacy initiatives. So we'll have the same format. So have a break, and if you could come back by 11 o'clock, is that right? Yep, so 11 o'clock. Thank you.